That thing is dead, the old man laughed, wiping grease off his hands. You want to give me $46 for a pile of rust? Olivia didn't look at him. She was looking at the motorcycle. I'll take it, she said. Nobody in that parking lot believed she knew what she was doing. Nobody believed that rusted, broken machine had anything left to give. And nobody, not one single person, could have predicted what that $46 decision was about to set in motion. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Olivia Bennett was 24 years old the morning she handed over her last $46 for a motorcycle that hadn't run in years. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the kind of woman who made decisions without thinking them through. In fact, most people who knew her would have said the opposite. They would have said Olivia thought too much, carried too much, held on too tight to things that had already slipped away. She had that quality that some people are born with and never quite shake, the kind of deep, internal stillness that gets mistaken for timidity by people who don't know the difference between a woman who is afraid and a woman who is simply waiting. She had been waiting a long time. The town of Ridgecrest, Arizona is the kind of place that feels like it exists slightly outside of time. The heat comes down in August like something biblical, pressing on your shoulders, baking the asphalt until it shimmers and warps. There's a tire shop on Route 14 that's been there since the 80s, and behind it, if you walk around back past the stacked rims and the dead refrigerators and the oil drums somebody was going to recycle someday, there's a chain link fence with a padlock. And behind that fence is where Bobby Trask kept his overflow inventory, which was a generous way of saying his junk. Olivia had driven past that fence 100 times. She'd seen the shapes through the chain link, the hulks of old machines, metal bones catching the light, wrong rust colonies spreading slow and patient across surfaces that had once been beautiful. She never stopped. She didn't have a reason to stop. Until the morning she did. She'd been up since 4. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had become unreliable since her father died, slipping away from her at odd hours and leaving her alone with a house that was too quiet and a mind that wouldn't shut off. She'd been lying on her back, staring at the ceiling, when she decided she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't lie there in that particular silence for one more minute. So she got up, made coffee she barely tasted, and started driving without a destination. She ended up on Route 14 because that's where driving without a destination took you in Ridgecrest. The road opened up and the sky was still dark at the edges, and there was that particular quality of early morning in the desert where the air almost feels cool and everything is quiet enough that you can hear yourself think whether you want to or not. She pulled over when she saw it. She didn't know why exactly. Later, she would try to explain it to people and find that the explanation never quite landed right. There was a shape behind the fence that caught her eye. A silhouette in the gray pre-dawn light that was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately place, and then she recognized it. The long, low geometry, the fork angle, the tank shape that was specific to a particular era of American motorcycle manufacturing. She got out of her truck. She stood at the fence for a long time just looking. The motorcycle was buried under several years of accumulated debris. A tarp had partially covered it at some point and then given up, leaving only the suggestion of protection. A strip of faded blue plastic caught under the rear wheel, the rest gone to the wind or the weather or wherever tarps go when nobody's watching. Rust had moved across the chrome like something organic, spreading from the chrome highway pegs up through the exhaust pipes, claiming territory with quiet efficiency. The seat was split open, the foam inside gone gray and crumbling. The front tire was flat, the rear tire was worse. But the frame, Olivia put her hands on the chain link and leaned forward. The frame was solid. She could see that even from a distance, even in the failing dark. The lines were clean. The welds, the ones she could make out, had been laid by someone who knew what they were doing. Someone from an era when the work was done by hand and the people doing it were proud of it. The geometry was right. Everything that mattered most, everything you couldn't replace or fake or work around, was sitting there intact under the rust and the damage and the years of neglect. She went around to the front of the tire shop when it opened at 7 and asked for Bobby Trask. Bobby was 62 years old and had the face of a man who'd spent most of those years outdoors. He came out wiping his hands on a shop rag and squinting at her like he was trying to figure out what she was selling. "The Harley behind your fence," Olivia said. "I want to buy it. Bobby looked at her for a moment, then looked out toward the fence, then looked back at her. The one in the back, the old Electra Glide, yes. Lady, he said, and his tone was not unkind, just factual, the tone of a man who had no interest in wasting anyone's time. That thing is not a motorcycle anymore. That's a lawn ornament. That's a habitat for desert mice. I know what it looks like, Olivia said. What do you want for it? Bobby named a figure. Olivia looked at him steadily and said nothing. Bobby adjusted the figure. Olivia said nothing. Bobby made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh and said, "You know what, you want to haul that piece of junk off my lot? You make me an offer." Olivia said $46. Bobby looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. $46. That's what I have. Lady, you weren't going to do anything with it, Olivia said. It's been sitting back there for at least 3 years, maybe 4. The tarp's been gone for 2 winters, which means you stopped thinking about it a long time ago. I'll haul it out of here myself. You don't have to lift a finger, and I'll give you $46 for the privilege. Bobby studied her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not quite respect, but a kind of recalibration. The look of a man who has reassessed a situation and found it more interesting than he originally thought. What are you going to do with it? He asked. Fix it, Olivia said. Bobby laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not mean, just surprised the laugh of someone who has been caught off guard by the specific confidence of another person. That thing is dead, he said. I'm serious. I've been in this business 30 years. I know a dead engine when I see one. You're probably right, Olivia said. Do we have a deal? I took her money. He helped her load it in the end because Bobby Trask was not actually the kind of man who would let a woman wrestle a rusted motorcycle frame into a truck bed alone, whatever he said about it. And as she pulled out of the lot, he called after her. Hey, she stopped. What's your name? Olivia. Bobby shook his head slowly, like something was amusing him. Good luck, Olivia, he said. It didn't sound like he thought she'd need it. It sounded like he thought she was completely out of her mind. She drove home with the Harley in the truck bed, the chain she'd used to secure it rattling against the wheel well at every bump, and she thought about her father. Thomas Bennett had not been a famous man. He was not the kind of person who made the news or left a large footprint on the world in any official documented way. He was a mechanic in a small town, and then he was a sick man in a hospital bed, and then he was a memory. But he had given Olivia something before all of that happened, something that took up no space in a will or an estate, filing something you couldn't quantify or photograph or put in a box. I had taught her what the inside of a machine felt like, not metaphorically, literally. From the time she was 6 years old and small enough to squeeze into tight spaces under motorcycle frames without complaining. Her father had been narrating the mechanical world to her in a low, patient voice that she could still hear if she concentrated. This is the primary drive chain, and this is why it matters. This is what worn means versus damaged. See the difference. Worn is gradual. Damaged is something happened. You always want to know which one you're dealing with before you start spending money. This is why you do the diagnosis before the repair, always no exceptions. She had absorbed it all without knowing she was absorbing it. It was just her father's voice, just Saturday mornings in a garage that smelled like motor oil and coffee, and the particular dusty warmth of an Arizona afternoon. She didn't know until much later that not everyone grew up like that. She didn't know until she was older and away from home and trying to explain something to a boyfriend who kept looking at her blankly, that most women her age had never held a carburetor, had never felt the specific resistance of a seized bolt, had never learned to diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. By the time she understood what her father had given her, he was already sick. She'd moved back home. She'd taken care of him through 18 months that she didn't talk about, not to anyone, not even now. She'd sold things she'd needed to sell and let things go that she'd needed to let go and been present for everything that needed presence, because that's what you did. And when it was over and the house was sold and the bills were settled, she was 23 years old with a truck, a backpack, a few $100s, and a specific, quiet determination to rebuild something. She hadn't known what exactly, until that fence. The first morning she just looked at it. She'd unloaded the Harley into her rented garage, a single-car space attached to a little house on the east side of Ridgecrest. The cheapest rental she'd found, and she'd rolled the frame to the center of the concrete floor and turned on the overhead light and just looked. She walked around it slowly the way her father had taught her to approach any diagnostic situation, starting with the full picture before you narrowed down to details. Don't let one bad thing catch your eye and make you miss the other bad things. See it whole first. What she saw was bad. Not as bad as Bobby had implied. Bobby, she suspected, had not actually looked at this machine up close in some time because up close the story was more complicated than junk. There was corrosion, yes, there was damage. The fuel tank had a dent on the left side that had gone untreated long enough that rust had eaten through in one spot, a small perforation near the seam that would need work. The carburetor was gum solid, she could tell without taking it apart, just by the way it wouldn't move. The primary chain was stretched and probably cracked in places she couldn't see yet. The wiring harness had been partially exposed to weather, and there would be shorts and breaks throughout, which meant she was essentially looking at rewiring the electrical system from scratch. The engine she couldn't assess yet. The engine was the question. She stood there for a long time without touching anything, just running through the sequence in her head, the way her father had taught her. What do you know? What don't you know? What's the order of operations? You don't spend money on a paint job before you know the engine runs. You don't rebuild a carburetor before you know the cylinder walls are good. You work from the inside out always because the outside is what people see and the inside is what matters. She pulled a stool over and sat down and got to work on the primary cover. By the time her neighbor and an older man named Gerald, who walked his beagle every morning at 8, appeared at the garage door, she was elbow deep in the primary chain case and had already identified 3 separate problems, 2 of which were fixable and 1 of which she needed to think about. Gerald looked at the motorcycle, then at Olivia, then at the motorcycle again. Found yourself a project, he said. Working on it, she said. What kind of shape is it in? Olivia considered the question honestly. Bad, she said, but specific bad. Not random bad. Most of the damage has a reason and most of the reasons have solutions. Gerald scratched his chin. You know about motorcycles. My father taught me, she said. Gerald nodded like that was a complete answer, which it was. He wished her good luck and continued down the street with his beagle, and Olivia went back to work. The days that followed developed a rhythm. She was up early because sleep was still unreliable. She made coffee. She went out to the garage. She worked until the heat became prohibitive. Usually by 10 in the morning, then she went inside and ate something and read whatever documentation she could find. She'd started buying old service manuals at a used bookstore downtown, tracking down information specific to this engine configuration in this model year, filling in gaps in her knowledge with research, the way her father had always filled in gaps with research. He'd been a mechanic who read. Most people didn't understand how much reading was involved in good mechanical work. She went back to the garage in the late afternoon when the heat dropped. She worked until 9, sometimes 10. She did this every day. The neighbors talked, of course. She knew they talked because she could feel it in the quality of the glances she got, the way conversation shifted when she walked past the particular energy of people who have a shared topic that they're managing carefully around the subject herself. She heard fragments, sometimes not quite by accident. What's she trying to prove? Was one she caught clearly. One morning when 2 women on the sidewalk didn't realize she was in the garage with the door open and the radio off. Women and motorcycles, another voice said, and then something lower she couldn't make out, and then laughter. She put her attention back on the carburetor. She didn't have the luxury of caring about the laughter. She had a carburetor that wasn't going to clean itself. The engine was the problem she'd been circling for 2 weeks before she was ready to address it. Everything else she'd managed to work through the wiring. She'd taken her time with mapping the original harness and replacing runs that were compromised using proper connectors, not splicing if she could avoid it. The fuel system had been a full rebuild, new petcock, new lines, clean tank with the rust treated from the inside. The carburetor she'd soaked and disassembled and cleaned and rebuilt 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The needle set right, the float level, correct, the jets clear. The frame she'd stripped of rust and treated and primed. The seat she'd found a leather shop in town run by a man named Eduardo, who'd taken one look at the original seat pattern and quoted her a fair price and delivered something that was better than original, the stitching, exact the material, heavy enough to last. All of that was the work you could plan, the work that went according to logic. You identified the problem, you identified the solution, you executed the solution, you moved on. The engine didn't work that way. The engine was a conversation. She pulled the heads on a Wednesday morning in late September when the heat had finally started to break and the air had that particular clarity that comes to the desert in the fall. She set up carefully before she started, organized her tools, made sure she had what she'd need, made sure there was enough light. She took the head bolts out in the correct sequence, working gradually across the pattern to release the tension evenly, the way her father had shown her. You never want to lift one side before the other, you release evenly. You let the gasket surface come apart cleanly. She lifted the first head, and she started to understand what she was dealing with. The cylinders were worn but within tolerance, not badly and not unevenly, which meant this engine had been maintained well during its life before it was abandoned. The valves needed work, the guides were worn, the seats needed cutting. The pistons were okay, the rings she would replace as a matter of course. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, methodical and careful, making notes, taking measurements, comparing what she found against the specifications in the service manual. By 9 o'clock, she had a complete picture of the engine's condition, which was fixable. Not cheap, not fast, but absolutely definitively fixable by someone who knew what they were doing and was willing to take the time. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd taken apart. "Okay," she said to the engine out loud in the empty garage, because that was something her father used to do, talk to the machines he was working on, narrate the diagnosis like he was explaining it to someone. "Okay, you've been in worse shape than this. We're going to figure this out." She didn't think about how strange it was to talk to an engine. It felt natural. It felt like the most natural thing she'd done in 2 years. 3 weeks later, she tried to start it for the first time. The first attempt was a failure, but not a bad failure. The engine turned over, which was more than she'd expected, but it wouldn't fire, which told her the carburetor jetting was still slightly off. She adjusted, tried again. The engine turned over and coughed and died. She adjusted the choke, tried again. On the fourth attempt in the early morning, with the desert cold and the sky just beginning to go pink at the edge, the engine caught. It ran rough. It was missing and stumbling, and there was a vibration in the primary she'd need to address, and she could hear a slight ticking she'd have to track down. It was not a healthy engine, not yet, but it was running. Olivia sat on the garage floor and listened to it run, and felt something move through her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't triumph exactly, it was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of something coming back that you thought you'd lost. It was the feeling of recognizing yourself in a mirror after a long absence. She let it run for 3 minutes, then shut it off. She sat in the silence and thought about her father. She wished, in the specific way that grief ambushes you at moments of accomplishment, that he could have heard that. She went inside and made coffee and cried a little, which she was not going to tell anyone about, and then she came back out and kept working. The Saturday she took it out for the first road test was in October, 6 weeks after she brought the motorcycle home. I rode it 10 miles out. Route 14, the same road where she'd first seen it behind Bobby Trask's fence, and 10 miles back, and it performed better than she had any right to expect. The engine was smooth now, the primary quiet, the electrical system solid. It pulled strong, it tracked straight. When she came to a stop at the turnaround point and sat there with the engine idling, listening to it, she felt something she hadn't felt since before her father got sick. She felt like herself. On the way back, she saw the motorcycles. She almost didn't notice them at first, a group of riders heading the opposite direction on the far side of the road, the thunder of their engines carrying before them like a weather front. She registered the sound as background, the way you register traffic when you're focused on other things, and kept her eyes on the road. Then one of them slowed, then more of them. She watched in her mirror as the group turned around, a coordinated sweep, 20 bikes minimum, moving together with the specific cohesion of people who spend a lot of time riding together, and started following her. She didn't panic. She almost panicked. There was a moment where her hands tightened on the bars and her heart rate went up, and every instinct she had started cataloging exit routes. But she kept her speed steady and her eyes forward, and reminded herself that she was on a public road in the middle of the afternoon, and that the group of motorcycles behind her had not done anything threatening. They were just following her. She didn't speed up. She didn't slow down. She held her line and kept going. And when she reached the pull-off at the edge of town where the road widened and there was room for multiple bikes, She turned in. If they were going to talk to her, she'd rather do it while she was stopped. They pulled in behind her, around her. More bikes than she'd counted in the mere 22 she would learn later, almost a full Ridgecrest chapter out on a Saturday afternoon run. The man who came forward was not the biggest. That surprised her. He was medium height and medium build, and somewhere in his mid-50s, with gray working through his dark beard and eyes that were very steady, the kind of eyes that had spent a lot of time measuring things and keeping their measurements to themselves. The back of his vest said Donovan, and above that, the bottom rocker said Arizona, and above that, she'd known what she was dealing with from the moment she saw the patches. Everybody in Ridgecrest knew the local chapter. You didn't have to be in the life to know who was in it. Jack Donovan stopped a few feet away from the motorcycle and looked at it, not at her at the motorcycle. The way a person looks at something that has surprised them. He walked around the front of it slowly, looking at the engine, then the primary, then the frame, and there was something in how he moved that reminded her powerfully and unexpectedly of her father doing the same thing. The deliberate attention, the focused quiet. "This is an electric glide," he said finally. It was not a question. 1976, Olivia said. He looked up at her. "Where'd you find it?" "Behind Trask's tire shop." Something shifted in his face. "Bobby Trask's place." "Yes." He looked at the motorcycle again. "I know that bike," he said slowly. "Bobby's had that thing in his back lot for it had to be 4 years. Because maybe. We kept telling him to get rid of it." He looked at her. "You rebuilt this?" She nodded. "All of it." "All of it," she said. "Engine, electrical, fuel system. The seats new leather, but the frame's original." Jack Donovan was quiet for a moment. He turned back to the motorcycle and looked at the engine specifically, and she watched him notice things. The valve cover gaskets, the primary cover, the wiring at the headlight bucket. His eyes were moving over the work, the way her father's had, reading the details, decoding what the details meant about the person who'd done them. "Who taught you?" he said. "My father," she said. "Thomas Bennett." Jack Donovan looked at her for a long moment after she said that. She couldn't read his expression. It had closed somehow, become more careful, and she didn't know why. Why? One of the other riders, a younger man, maybe 35, with a red bandana showing at his collar, came forward and said something quietly to Jack that she couldn't hear. Jack didn't respond to him. He kept looking at Olivia. "Thomas Bennett," he said like he was testing the name. "From here, Ridgecrest." "Yes," she said. "He passed away last year." "I know," Jack said. She felt the ground shift slightly under the conversation. There was something here she didn't understand yet, some current running under the words that she couldn't access. She waited because waiting was sometimes the only tool you had. Jack looked at the motorcycle again. He looked at it for a long time, then he looked at her. "How much did you pay for it?" he asked. $46, she said. The sound that came out of Jack Donovan was not quite a laugh. It was something in the neighborhood of a laugh, but shorter and quieter, almost involuntary. The younger rider next to him looked surprised. Olivia got the impression that involuntary sounds from Jack Donovan were a rare event. $46, Jack said. "It's all I had," she said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When you were going through the bike, when you were taking it apart and doing the diagnosis, did you find anything unexpected?" Olivia looked at him. Unexpected how? Jack's expression was careful, measured, giving nothing away. "Anything that surprised you," he said. "Inside the bike, compartments, storage, anything like that." She thought about the question. She thought about what she'd found and what she hadn't found, and what the question itself implied about what he already knew. "No," she said. "Nothing like that." Why, Jack Donovan held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "No reason," he said. "Come by the shop sometime. We'll buy you a coffee." He walked back to his motorcycle. The group of riders around her followed one by one until they were all moving again, a sound like sustained thunder pulling away down Route 14. Olivia stood beside the Harley and watched them go. She thought about the question he'd asked. The specific question. Not about the engine, not about the electrical system, not about any of the things a person would naturally ask about a motorcycle rebuild. He'd asked about hidden compartments. She went home. She went out to the garage. She turned on the lights and stood in front of the motorcycle for a long time. Then she went back to work. She went back over every inch of that motorcycle that night. Not because Jack Donovan had told her to. Not because she'd found anything the first time that warranted a second look. She went back because his question had burrowed into something in the back of her mind and refused to leave the precision of it, the casualness that wasn't quite casual, the way he'd held her gaze afterward for exactly 3 seconds too long before deciding on no reason as his answer. Jack Donovan did not strike her as a man who asked questions for no reason. He struck her as a man who chose every word with the deliberateness of someone who had learned at some cost that careless words had consequences. So she went back to the garage and she started at the front fender and worked her way back. She checked the headlight bucket first. She'd been inside it for the rewiring, so she knew that space well, but she ran her hands around the inside of it again. Anyway, nothing. She went to the fork tubes and tapped them, listening for any variance in tone that might indicate a hidden void. Nothing. She went along the frame spine, slowly pressing and tapping, paying attention to the way the metal sounded under her knuckles. She checked the backbone, the down tube, the seat struts. She was at the rear fender, crouched down with her hand behind the battery tray when she found it. Not a compartment, not exactly. A section of frame tubing at the lower rear part of the subframe that ran under the seat that had been modified. Subtle. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. The weld seams were clean and matched the original frame construction closely enough that you'd never see it unless you were looking for it or had run your hands across it in the dark. But she could feel it now. The slight irregularity at the joint where a section had been cut and replaced with a sealed tube rather than the original open section. Her heart rate went up. She got a flashlight. She found the access, a small threaded cap at one end of the modified section, disguised as a frame plug, painted over and rusted enough that it looked original. She needed a socket wrench to break the seal, and when she did, she heard the slight pressure differential equalize, which meant the inside had been sealed against moisture and temperature change. Deliberately sealed, intentionally. She tilted the motorcycle and felt something shift inside. She reached in with 2 fingers and found the edge of something wrapped in oilskin cloth, a material chosen specifically because it didn't degrade, didn't absorb moisture, didn't become brittle in heat. Whoever put this here had been thinking about time. They had been thinking about preservation. She worked it out carefully the way her father had taught her to work anything out of a tight space, slow, patient, no forcing, no rushing. The package came free in her hands. She set it on her workbench and stood there looking at it for a full minute before she opened it. Inside was a collection of documents. Folded papers, some of them aged to the color of weak tea. A small bundle of photographs held with a rubber band that crumbled. When she touched it, the photographs themselves protected inside a separate sleeve of clear plastic. And beneath all of that, rolled and secured with a piece of leather cord, a set of large format papers that she recognized immediately as mechanical drawings. Blueprint quality drawings, done by hand, but with a precision that made the hair on her arms stand up. She unrolled the top sheet carefully and held it under the garage light. It was a motorcycle design, not a sketch, not a concept, a full technical drawing, dimensioned and annotated with detail, call-outs for specific components in assembly notes. Written in a hand she'd been seeing her whole life, her father's handwriting. Olivia sat down on the garage floor because her legs had made a decision her brain hadn't caught up to yet. She sat there with the drawing in her hands and looked at her father's handwriting, the particular way he formed his sevens with a European cross-stroke, the way his letters leaned slightly right as if they were always moving towards something, and she felt the floor of her understanding of the past 2 years shift completely. She'd thought she knew the shape of her father's life. She'd thought through 18 months of close caregiving, through all the conversations and silences, and long evenings in the hospital room, she'd come to understand the whole territory of who he had been. She'd thought the story was complete, if painful. She had been wrong. She started going through the other papers. She was still on the garage floor at 3 in the morning. The documents spread around her in a careful arrangement she'd created without thinking about it. Her coffee cold and forgotten on the workbench. When she finally put together enough of the picture to understand what she was looking at. Her father had not always been a small-town mechanic in Ridgecrest, Arizona. She'd known that in a general way, known that he'd lived in other places before she was born, that there was a period of his life he didn't talk about much, a chapter that had been closed and apparently locked from the inside. She'd been a child when she first noticed the absence, the careful way he redirected certain conversations. And by the time she was old enough to ask direct questions, she'd absorbed enough of his particular quality of silence to understand that some doors were not for opening. She understood now why he'd kept them closed. The drawings were his, the designs were his, a series of custom motorcycle concepts spanning what looked like 15 years of work, built on a set of engineering principles that, where she could see it clearly, even she who was not a designer but a builder, distinctive enough to constitute a genuine design language. There was a recognizable DNA to the work, a set of proportional relationships and engineering choices that ran through every design the way a voice runs through everything a person says, regardless of the words. The photographs were harder, mostly workshop shots, her father in various garage settings, younger than she'd ever seen him, standing with other men she didn't recognize, beside motorcycles that she recognized from the drawings. But there were other photographs too, group shots, events. One photograph that made her stop breathing for a moment, her father, young and unlined, standing in front of a motorcycle at what appeared to be a competition of some kind, holding a trophy. He was grinning. She had never seen him grin like that. It was the grin of a person who had gotten exactly what they'd worked for, who was standing in the moment of it and knew it was real. Beside him in that photograph was a man she didn't recognize. Older, heavyset, with the kind of confident ease around cameras of someone who expected to be photographed. He had his hand on her father's shoulder in a way that looked friendly, but the longer she looked at it, felt like something else. Proprietary, like a hand on something you own. The papers told the rest of the story. Business documents, some of them, letters, a contract she had to read 3 times before she fully understood its implications. Her father had been a partner in a custom motorcycle business. A real one, not a hobby operation, not a small town side project, but a legitimate operation that had, based on the documents she was reading, been building a significant reputation in the regional custom scene in the early 1990s. The designs were his. The work was his. The other man's name appeared on the business documents as a co-founder, but she could see from the creative records, the dated sketches, the development notes, that the creative engine of the operation had been her father entirely. And then something had happened. She couldn't piece together the exact sequence from the documents alone. But the shape of it was there in the gap between the early letters, which were energetic and detailed and full of planning language, and the later ones, which were short and careful, and had the flattened quality of words written by someone who had been beaten down and was choosing them very deliberately to avoid triggering something. A dispute, a legal situation. The company had been restructured based on the most recent documents in a way that left her father's name off the ownership entirely. His designs, his work, his name gone from it. One last letter dated in 1994, the year Olivia was born, was from her father to the other man. 2 paragraphs. She read them twice. The first paragraph was a formal notice of withdrawal. Her father was walking away. He would not contest the ownership restructuring. He would not pursue any legal remedy. He was leaving. The second paragraph was a single sentence. I'm keeping the bike, Marcus, and everything in it. And if you ever come looking for either, you'll find out what I'm willing to do to protect what belongs to me. She sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the only number she had for Jack Donovan. He'd had one of his writers give it to her before they left, a detail she'd found slightly odd at the time and now found considerably more significant. It was 3:15 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. You weren't asleep, she said. No, he said. I found it, she said. A pause, not the pause of surprise. The pause of a man who had been expecting a specific call and was deciding how to respond now that it had come. I'll send someone to bring you in, he said. I'll drive myself, Olivia said. Another pause. Okay, he said. You know where we are. I'll find it, she said. She repacked the documents carefully in the oilskin and put them in her backpack and rode the Harley across town to the address Jack had given her. The engine was smooth and steady under her, and the streets were empty, and the night had that specific desert quality of total quiet, the kind of silence that isn't absence of sound but presence of something larger. The Chapter Club house was an industrial building on the south side of town. Not what she'd expected, not that she'd had clear expectations. There were lights on inside and several motorcycles in the lot, and a man she didn't recognize standing at the door who saw her coming, stepped aside without a word and held the door. Jack was inside with 4 other men. She recognized none of them. The space smelled like coffee and motor oil and something older underneath the way room smell when they've held decades of conversation and decisions in the particular gravity of people taking things seriously. She put the backpack on the table without speaking and unrolled the drawings. Nobody said anything for a long moment. One of the older men, gray-haired with the weathered look of someone who'd been riding since before Olivia was born, leaned forward and put his hands on the edge of the table and looked at the drawings. Then he looked at Jack. Something passed between them, a look with the compressed quality of a communication that has context Olivia didn't have access to. Thomas kept them, the older man said. Thomas kept them, Jack confirmed. Who's Marcus? Olivia said. The room went quiet in a particular way. Jack looked at her. Where did you hear that name? Letter, she said. In the package. My father wrote a letter to someone named Marcus. He said he was keeping the bike and everything in it. She paused. Who is Marcus? Jack picked up a mug and drank from it and set it down. He appeared to be deciding something. Whatever the decision was, he made it quickly. Marcus Hale, he said. He was your father's business partner for about 7 years, starting around 1987. I know about the business, Olivia said. I read the documents. Hale took the company. Hale took everything, Jack said. The client relationships, the shop, the name, the reputation. He had a lawyer and your father didn't, and the partnership agreement was written by Hale's lawyer, and your father signed it because he trusted the man and because he was 29 years old and didn't know what he was signing. Jack's voice was flat and even, but there was something behind it. Something controlled the kind of anger that has been lived with long enough to become furniture. By the time your father understood what he'd signed, it was done. He walked away, Olivia said. He walked away, Jack said, because the alternative was a legal fight he couldn't afford and couldn't win, and because Hale had made it very clear that if your father made noise, he'd make your father's life considerably worse before the lawyers were done. Hale threatened him, Olivia said. Hale was good at threatening people, Jack said. He was not a man who ever worried much about the ethics of a situation. He worried about the outcome. Olivia absorbed this. How do you know all of this? Because we were there, Jack said simply. Some of us. Your father had friends in the community, Olivia. People who knew his work. People who were watching when Hale did what he did and couldn't do anything useful about it at the time. Couldn't or didn't, she said. It came out harder than she meant it to. She saw a couple of the men react a slight shift, a recalibration, and Jack just looked at her without any visible reaction at all. Couldn't, he said. Your father asked us not to. He was very specific about that. He said he didn't want what came with it, with us getting involved in a civilian business dispute. He said he wanted to walk away clean and start over and not have anything following him. So he came to Ridgecrest, Olivia said. He came to Ridgecrest, Jack said. He opened a small shop. He worked on other people's machines and he didn't build anything of his own for a long time. And then eventually he had a daughter and a life, and it seemed like maybe the old chapter had just ended, the way some chapters do. Except he kept the drawings, Olivia said. He kept the drawings, Jack said, and he kept the bike, and he put the drawings in the bike, which is either the act of a man who was done with it or the act of a man who was keeping the option open. He was keeping it for me, Olivia said. The room was quiet. The bike was registered in my name, she said. After he died, I found the paperwork in his files. He'd had it transferred into my name years ago. I thought it was just administrative keeping track of his assets. But he knew it was at Bobby's lot. He knew where it was. He put it there. Jack looked at her steadily. Why would he put it there? Because he knew I'd find it eventually, Olivia said. He knew I'd end up back in Ridgecrest after everything was done. He knew I didn't have any money, and he knew that Bobby Trask would charge whatever I offered because Bobby has never in his life turned down cash for something he had already written off. She paused. He left me a treasure map, just not one that looked like a treasure map. She expected someone to object to this, to find the reasoning too neat or too sentimental. Instead, the gray-haired man at the end of the table made a sound that was close to a laugh. Thomas was the most complicated, uncomplicated man I ever knew, he said. His name is Roy, by the way, Roy Decker. He extended a hand across the table. She shook it. The drawings are real, Roy, Jack said without taking his eyes off Olivia. She found everything. I can see that, Roy said. The question, Jack said, is what she does with them. The question, Olivia said, is what Marcus Hale has been doing with them. Another one of those silences. This one felt different from the others, charged differently, weighted differently, like a room after lightning. Explain, Jack said. My father's designs were the foundation of that business, Olivia said. Hale kept the business. He's been building on that foundation for 30 years. He's been using my father's work. Yes, Jack said, without my father's name on any of it. Yes, Jack said. And now I have documentation, Olivia said, dated, in my father's handwriting, showing that every design principle those motorcycles were built on came from Thomas Bennett. The room was very quiet. Jack set his mug down with a careful deliberateness that she was starting to recognize as his version of a significant reaction. You need a lawyer, he said. I need to understand what I have first, Olivia said. And I need to understand what Hale has been doing. And I need to understand whether there's anyone still in the custom motorcycle community who remembers what my father's work looked like. There are, Roy said. There are people who remember. Would they say so publicly? Olivia asked. Roy and Jack exchanged a look. That's the right question, Roy said. You've been asking questions since I met you, Olivia said, looking at Jack. You knew about the hidden compartment before I found it. You knew about my father and Hale. You knew about the drawings. She waited. What else do you know? Jack leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Marcus Hale, he said slowly, is not in Ridgecrest. He's in Phoenix. He's running a high-end custom shop, very successful, high-profile clients, some of the best exposure in the regional market. And about 4 months ago, he announced that he's entering a custom build in the Southwest Circuit Championship, the major one in December. Big event, prize money press, the whole thing. Jack paused. The design he's entering has people talking. People who know the work say it looks like nothing he's built before. Different sensibility, different proportional logic. Some people are saying it's a breakthrough, a new direction. Olivia felt something cold move through her chest. Show me, she said. Roy pulled out a phone and set it on the table and slid it toward her. She looked at the screen. The motorcycle in the photograph was unfinished, clearly still in progress based on the workshop context in the image. But the lines of it were visible enough to read the geometry, clear enough to understand the design intent. She knew those proportions. She had been looking at them all night in her father's handwriting on drawings sealed inside a frame tube for 30 years. He has another set of drawings, she said. He has to. There are designs in the package I found that don't match what's here, some of them, not all. But the ones that do match, he has copies. Or he has the originals, and my father's set is the copy. Or your father gave him access to some and kept others, Jack said. Or my father gave him access to some and kept others, she agreed. Either way, Hale is building something using your father's design language, Jack said. And he's about to win a major competition with it and add another credential to a career that was built on your father's foundation. He paused, and nobody would know the difference, except people who saw Thomas Bennett's work 30 years ago and are old enough now that their memories get dismissed as nostalgia. Olivia sat back. She thought about her father in that photograph grinning, the hand on his shoulder. She thought about him in the hospital at the end and how he'd never once mentioned any of this. She thought about the letter, I'm keeping the bike and everything in it, and what it had cost him to write that sentence and then close the door and walk away. She thought about the motorcycle she'd rebuilt, the engine that had run again in the early morning desert cold, while she sat on the floor of her garage and felt something come back to life in her chest. She thought about what it meant that he'd sealed those drawings in that particular machine, not hidden them in a storage unit, not put them in a safe deposit box, not given them to a lawyer. Put them in a motorcycle, specifically the motorcycle he'd put in her name. Her father had been the most complicated, uncomplicated man, and he had trusted her. I'm going to enter the Southwest Circuit Championship, Olivia said. The room was quiet for a beat. Then Roy made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. With what? Jack asked. His voice was not dismissive. He was asking a real question. With my father's original design, Olivia said. The full one, the complete version of what Hale has a piece of. She looked at Jack directly. If Hale has been building on my father's work without his name on it, then the best answer is to put the complete work in the room next to Hale's incomplete version and let people who know the field look at both of them. You'd need resources, Roy said. Parts, materials, space. I'd need help, Olivia said, which was not a thing she said easily or often. It felt like putting something down she'd been carrying for a long time. I'm not going to pretend I can do this alone. I need people who know the competition circuit, who know the judges, who know what this build would have to accomplish. And I need people who knew my father's work and are willing to say so. Jack Donovan looked at her for a long time. His expression was that same careful, measured quality, the look of a man running calculations, weighing variables. You understand, he said, that this is not a small thing. Hale has money and lawyers and 30 years of cultivated relationships in this market. If you go at him publicly and you don't have everything exactly right, he buries you and the story gets told his way. I know, Olivia said. You understand that even with the documents you have, this is not simple. I know, she said. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying it's right. She paused. My father spent 30 years not doing anything about this because he thought the fight would cost more than he had to spend. He walked away. He built a life anyway quietly, and I'm not going to tell you that was the wrong choice for him. She looked at the drawing on the table between them, the clean, precise lines of her father's hand. But he's gone now, and I'm not him, and I have the drawings, and I have the motorcycle, and I have— She stopped. You have what? Jack said. Olivia looked at him. I have the same hands, she said. He taught me everything he knew, every design principle, every technical choice. I've been rebuilding that motorcycle for 2 months, and the reason I could do it is because he put 30 years of knowledge into me before I knew what he was putting there. She spread her hands flat on the table, both of them palms down. Still grease under the fingernails even after scrubbing. I can build what's in those drawings. I know I can. I just need time and resources and people who'll stand up and say what they know. The room held the silence for a moment. Then Jack Donovan unfolded his arms and put both hands flat on the table, mirroring her without appearing to notice he was doing it. Roy, he said without looking away from Olivia. Yeah, Roy said. Get everyone together Saturday morning, Jack said. Full chapter. I want everybody there. He finally looked at Roy. Thomas Bennett's daughter needs a shop. Roy nodded once. The economy of it, the absence of any need for additional discussion, told Olivia something about the quality of the thing Jack Donovan had just committed to. She looked at her father's drawings on the table. She thought about a man who had sealed a piece of his life inside a motorcycle frame and left it for a 24-year-old woman to find in the dark. She thought, I'm going to finish this, Dad. She thought, I'm going to finish it right. Outside, the desert was still dark, but not for much longer. Saturday came fast. Olivia had not slept much in the 3 days between the meeting at the clubhouse and the morning Jack had told her to be there. She'd spent most of those nights at the workbench, with the drawings spread out in front of her, going through them systematically the way her father had taught her to go through any complex problem. Start with what you know. Build outward from certainty. Don't let the unknown parts panic you into skipping steps. She cataloged every design, dated each one where the dating was visible, cross-referenced the annotations against the technical specifications she knew from her own rebuilding experience. She was building a case in her head before she understood fully that a case was what she was building. She arrived at the clubhouse at 7 in the morning, and there were already 31 motorcycles in the lot. She counted them because counting was something to do with the specific nervous energy that had been running through her since she turned off Route 14 and saw the lot filling up. 31 bikes meant 31 people who'd been called in on a Saturday morning and had shown up. She didn't know what she'd expected: a smaller group, maybe a more private meeting, something that felt like a conversation rather than an assembly. This felt like an assembly. Jack met her at the door. He looked like a man who had also not slept much, but wore it differently, like it was a condition he'd made his peace with long ago. You ready? He said. I don't know what I'm getting ready for, she said honestly. Yeah, you do, he said, and he held the door. The room was loud when she walked in and went quiet in a ripple effect that started near the door and moved outward. She'd experienced that kind of quiet before, the particular silence of a group of people who have been told about you and are now looking at the actual you and making their adjustments. She held herself still under it and didn't look away from anyone who was looking at her, which her father had taught her was the only correct response to that kind of assessment. You look away. You've already told them something you might not want them to know. Roy Decker was at the front. He nodded at her when she came in, a nod that had the quality of a signal she was expected, she was welcome. The ground rules had been laid before she arrived. Jack stepped forward and spoke without preamble. Most of you know who Thomas Bennett was, he said. For the ones who don't, Thomas was one of the best builders this region ever produced. His work in the late 80s and early 90s set a standard that people in this community still reference whether they know it or not. He was our friend, and Marcus Hale stole his career. Jack paused, letting that sentence sit. This is Thomas's daughter, Olivia. She rebuilt the '76 Electroglide that Hale's partner used to store Thomas's original drawings. She found the documentation, and she's got a plan. He looked at her. 31 people looked at her. She thought about her father telling her when you're in front of people who don't believe you. Yet the worst thing you can do is try to convince them with words. Show them the work. She put the drawings on the table. She didn't make a speech. She unrolled the designs one by one and laid them flat, and she let the room come to her. It took about 40 seconds before the first person moved forward, an older man heavy-set with the quiet, deliberate movement of someone who has spent decades in workshops and has learned to approach unfamiliar work with the respect it might deserve. He looked at the first drawing for a long time without speaking. Then the second. Then a third man came forward, and the two of them were quiet together in the particular way of people who are having a conversation that doesn't require words because they share enough vocabulary to communicate in glances. These are Thomas's, the heavy-set man said finally. Not a question. Yes, Olivia said. I recognize the approach. He tapped a specific section of the drawing, the way the steering geometry integrated with the frame spine. He showed me something similar once. Years ago, I thought he was just theorizing. He wasn't theorizing, Olivia said. He was building. Hale kept the shop and the reputation and the client list. My father walked away with the bike and what was in it. The man looked up at her. What's your play? The Southwest Circuit Championship, she said. December. I want to build a complete version of what's in these drawings and put it in that room next to whatever Hale is submitting. The room held that for a moment. Then someone at the back said, that's 12 weeks. 11 and a half, Olivia said. For a ground-up custom build, the same voice said. It wasn't hostile, just precise, identifying the actual dimensions of what she was proposing. Yes, she said. Using what shop? She looked at Jack. This one, Jack said. The room made a sound, not quite agreement, not quite doubt, somewhere in the middle, the sound of people recalibrating. The heavy-set man, whose name she learned was Dale Pruitt, and who had known her father from the regional circuit in the late 80s, put his hand out. She shook it. I'll work the metal, he said. I've got a fabrication setup that'll do what you need. A younger man, younger than the others, maybe 40, with the wiry build of someone who didn't sit still, often said, from the side, I do paint and finish. I've done circuit-level work before. If the design is what these drawings say it is, I want to be in the room when it comes together. His name was Carter Webb, and she'd remember it later as the moment the project stopped being an idea and became a thing with momentum of its own. By the time the meeting broke up, she had a fabricator, a finish specialist, an electrical expert named Pam Souza, who was the only other woman in the room and who had the energy of someone who found most situations insufficiently challenging and access to a fully equipped shop that ran 24 hours because someone was always awake and someone could always use the space. She also had the chapter's institutional knowledge of Marcus Hale, which turned out to be considerable and considerably worse than she'd already understood. Roy pulled her aside before she left. He was the one who gave her the fuller picture delivered in the economical way of a man who doesn't believe in softening things that shouldn't be softened. Hale's operation in Phoenix is called Velocity Custom, Roy said. They do about 4 or 5 builds a year at the high end. Very visible clientele, entertainment tech, some old money. The press covers them. He's been on the cover of 2 national publications in the last 5 years. Roy paused. The design he's entering in December is called the Meridian. He announced it at a press thing in Phoenix last month. Motorcycle media picked it up. It's getting serious attention before it's even finished. Because it looks different, Olivia said. Because it looks better than anything he's done before, Roy said. That's what people are saying. The people who know his past work are saying it represents a significant creative leap for him. He let that sit. You understand what that means? It means he found the drawings, Olivia said. Or he always had them, Roy said. The question is whether he had access to the complete set or just the pieces your father let him see before the split. The design in the photographs you showed me, the meridian, it's pulling from 3 of the drawings I found, Olivia said. I went through them. The proportional system, the frame geometry, the way the engine is positioned in the chassis. Those are all in my father's notes. But there are 2 more drawings in the set that go further than what Hale's build shows. The complete version, the full realization of the design system, is in my father's work. What Hale has is a portion. Can you prove your father developed those elements first? The drawings are dated, Olivia said. Some of them go back to 1988. They're in my father's hand, and there are letters in the package that reference the design development in specific term with specific dates. Roy nodded slowly. You need those authenticated. You need someone with credentials to look at the documents and go on record about what they're looking at. Who would do that? She said. I know a man at the university in Tucson, Roy said. Retired now, but he spent 30 years teaching industrial design history. He's written about the custom motorcycle movement of that era. He knew your father's work by reputation. Roy looked at her directly. He'll tell the truth. That's all I can promise you. That's enough, she said. She rode home with the drawings secured in her backpack and a list in her head that had grown considerably since morning. The scale of what she'd committed to was becoming clearer with each mile, not in a way that frightened her exactly, but in a way that demanded she be honest with herself about the gap between where she was and where she needed to be. She was a woman who had rebuilt one motorcycle in a rented garage with limited tools and whatever she could source from used parts dealers. What she was proposing now was a ground-up custom build to competition standard executed in under 12 weeks based on design drawings that had been sealed in a frame tube for 30 years. The only reason she didn't turn around was that she knew the drawings were right. She'd been sitting with them for 3 days. She understood the design logic, understood it in the specific way that you understand something that was built into you before you knew it was happening, something that your hands know even when your head is still catching up. Her father had taught her the principles that generated the designs. She hadn't known that's what he was teaching her at the time. She'd thought she was learning how to work on engines. She'd been learning how to see. Tuesday, she drove to Tucson to meet the man Roy had called. His name was Dr. Arthur Keene, and he lived in a house near the university that was approximately 60% books and 40% everything else. He was in his mid-70s with the slightly rumpled precision of an academic who had never found anything more interesting than his work and had organized his life accordingly. He looked at the drawings for 45 minutes without speaking. Olivia sat in the chair across from him and drank the coffee he'd made strong good, the coffee of a man who took at least one thing very seriously and waited. These are from before 1991, he said finally. Not a question. The dates on the drawings go back to 1988, she said. I know Thomas Bennett's compositional logic, Keene said. I've written about it in passing in the context of the Hale Bennett work from that period. Except I didn't know then that I was writing about 2 different people's contributions. I thought I was writing about a single creative vision. He looked up at her over the drawings. I was wrong about that. Yes, Olivia said. The proportional system in these drawings, the way the mass distribution logic works, the relationship between the frame geometry and the engine placement, that's a specific design philosophy. It's not generic. You could not arrive at this by accident or by working from general principles. This is someone with a developed creative point of view working through a system they built from the ground up. He paused. I've seen Velocity Custom's recent announcement. The Meridian, and Olivia said. Keene took his glasses off and set them on the table. He looked at her. The Meridian is built on this design philosophy, he said. Whoever is designing for Velocity Custom has access to this thinking. Either they developed it independently, which would be an extraordinary coincidence of the kind that essentially doesn't occur in design, or they have access to this material. My father's name isn't on a single piece of Velocity Custom's public record, Olivia said. No, Keene said, it's not. He was quiet for a moment. I'll write a letter, a formal assessment with my credentials attached, describing what I'm looking at and when these design elements first appear in the documented record. He looked at the drawings again. Your father deserved better than what happened to him. I didn't know the whole story at the time. I'm sorry I didn't ask harder questions. You didn't know to ask, Olivia said. No, he said, but I should have noticed that the creative voice changed after the split. I did notice actually in retrospect. I wrote it off as a natural evolution. I was wrong. He put his glasses back on. I won't be wrong about this. She drove back to Ridgecrest with Keene's commitment in the drawings and a tight feeling in her chest that she recognized as the particular anxiety of a person who has started something they cannot stop and doesn't entirely want to stop and is also fully aware of every way it could go wrong. She started building the following Monday. The first week was foundation work, the frame, the basic architecture, the structural decisions that everything else would depend on. Dale Pruitt was in the shop by 6 every morning, and the quality of his fabrication work made her understand why Jack had trusted him without explanation. He didn't talk much while he worked, which suited her. He'd look at a drawing, ask 1 or 2 precise questions, and then disappear into the metal for 3 hours. When he came back up for air, what he'd made matched what the drawing specified with the accuracy of someone who had been doing this long enough to have internalized the relationship between intention and execution. Pam Souza appeared on the third day, looked at the electrical layout Olivia had sketched from her father's specs, made a sound that might have been approval, or might have been the preliminary stage of having opinions, and got to work. By the end of the week, she'd produced a wiring schematic that was cleaner than anything Olivia could have drafted herself and had already sourced 3 components that the original specs called for, but that nobody had manufactured in 15 years. "Where did you find those?" Olivia asked. "You don't want to know," Pam said. "Fair," Olivia said. Carter Webb came in on the evenings after whatever his day job was. She didn't ask, he didn't offer, and spent his time studying the design drawings and making notes. She couldn't always read, and asking questions about finished decisions that forced her to go back to her father's annotations and really parse what they said. He had the quality of someone who understood that paint and surface treatment were not decoration but communication, that the finish of a motorcycle at this level was an argument, and you needed to know what argument you were making before you started mixing colors. "What's the story you're telling?" he asked her one evening about 10 days in. They were alone in the shop, most of the chapter gone home. Olivia was working on the primary drive assembly and didn't look up right away. "Wouldn't? Every build tells a story," Carter said, "especially at circuit level. The judges aren't just looking at craft, they're reading meaning. What's the story this motorcycle is telling?" She set her wrench down. She thought about her father in that photograph grinning the hand on his shoulder. She thought about the letters sealed inside the frame tube. She thought about 30 years of silence. "Survival," she said. "The story is that some things survive being buried, that the work is real even when nobody's looking at it, that you can take someone's name off something, but you can't take away what made it." Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the motorcycle frame and back at her. "Okay," he said, "I know what color story that is." "What color story is it?" she said. "One that's going to make people feel something before they even read the placard," he said, and he went back to his notes. 3 weeks and Marcus Hale found out she existed. She didn't know how. The circuit community was not as large as it appeared from the outside, and the Southwest Championship drew from a specific pool of builders and shops and affiliated organizations, and word moved through that pool. The way water moves through connected spaces, finding the path of least resistance, appearing in unexpected places impossible to fully contain once it was in motion. Someone talked to someone. Someone mentioned Thomas Bennett's daughter and the build she was doing and the documentation she'd found. And that someone was eventually someone who was connected enough to Velocity Custom that the information traveled inward. She knew because Hale called it Jack. Jack told her about the call the same day it happened, which she appreciated. He sat across from her in the shop while she kept working. She'd learned that she thought better when her hands were occupied, and he delivered it without editorializing, which she also appreciated. "He called you," she said. "He called me," Jack said. "What did he say?" "He said he'd heard there was a build happening in Ridgecrest that was claiming some kind of connection to his company's design history. He said he wanted to clarify that all of Velocity Custom's design work was proprietary and original. He said making claims to the contrary, they should be aware that he takes IP issues very seriously." Jack paused. "Then he said that he had a lot of respect for our chapter, and he hoped this was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved quietly." Olivia kept working. "He threatened you," she said. "He attempted to," Jack said. "It didn't land the way he intended." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd pass along his concerns," Jack said. "Very politely. The corner of his mouth moved in something that was technically not a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. He didn't love that answer. She set her tool down and looked at Jack directly. He's going to come at this harder, she said. When the quiet approach doesn't work, he'll escalate. Legal, probably. Maybe pressure on the competition organizers. Maybe both. Probably, Jack said. How do the competition organizers feel about controversy? Depends on the controversy, Jack said. Controversy that makes them look bad, they avoid. Controversy that brings attention to the event, that's a different calculation. Olivia turned back to her work. She was thinking fast the way she thought best, through her hands, through the physical logic of what she was building, the mechanical problems organizing her mind, while the other problem ran alongside it. I need to file the entry, she said, before he can do anything to complicate it. I need my name in the competition, officially with the build documented, before he has time to talk to the right people. Roy already looked into it, Jack said. Entry deadline is 6 weeks out. You have time, but not a lot. I'll file this week, she said, under my name and my father's. Thomas and Olivia Bennett joint attribution. The design is his. The build is mine. Jack was quiet for a moment. Joint attribution might be harder to argue legally than sole attribution. It might be harder to argue legally, Olivia said. It'll be impossible to argue morally. And this fight is going to be won on one of those two grounds, and if it comes down to a legal contest, I'll probably lose, because Hale has 30 years of money behind him, and I have $46 and a set of drawings. She looked at Jack. So I want to win it on the other ground. I want to stand in that room in December with my father's motorcycle and his drawings and Dr. Thor Keene's letter and make it so obvious what happened that the legal argument becomes secondary. That's a different kind of fight than a courtroom, Jack said. Yes, Olivia said. It's the kind my father was afraid to start. He didn't think he could survive it. She picked up her wrench again. He also didn't know his daughter. Jack said nothing, but she felt something shift in the room, a quality of attention that was different from before, something that had moved from assessment into something closer to certainty. The call came on a Thursday night in the 5th week of the build. She was alone in the shop working on the tank fabrication. The number she didn't recognize appearing on her phone screen at 11:15 at night. She almost didn't answer. She answered because she'd been expecting something, and the not knowing was worse than the knowing. Is this Olivia Bennett? The voice was smooth, controlled. The voice of a man who had spent a long time making sure his voice communicated exactly what he wanted it to communicate and nothing else. Yes, she said. She set down her tool and gave the call her full attention. My name is Marcus Hale, the voice said. I think we should talk. The shop was quiet around her. The motorcycle frame sat on the lift, half-built, her father's design taking shape in steel and aluminum, in the specific way that things take shape when the person building them understands what they're building. She looked at it while Hale spoke. I understand you found some old documents, he said, some of your father's personal papers. I know this must be an emotional time. Thomas was a talented man, and losing him was clearly very hard for your family. I'm sorry for your loss. The sympathy was precisely calibrated, genuine enough in its delivery to make her skin crawl. But I want to make sure you understand the full picture before you do anything that could cause you real problems. Tell me the full picture, she said. Your father and I built something together, Hale said. It was a genuine partnership. Both of us contributed. The business went in a direction that required restructuring, and your father made the choice to step back. That choice was his, made freely. The documents you have are personal creative records, which he was entitled to keep. But they don't represent any kind of legal claim against Velocity Custom or against my current work. Our legal history is very clean. I'm sure it is, Olivia said. You had a lawyer who made sure of it. A pause, fractional, but she caught it. Your father had every opportunity to seek his own counsel, Hale said. He was 29 years old, she said. He trusted you. He made business decisions. You used his designs, Olivia said. Flat, not angry, precise. You're using them right now. The Meridian is built on design principles that my father developed and documented starting in 1908. I have the documentation. I have expert assessment of the documentation. And in 6 weeks, I'm going to put the full realization of those design principles in the same room as your incomplete version and let everyone who knows the field draw their own conclusions. Hale was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted. You're making a serious mistake, he said. His voice had dropped a register. The smooth overlay was still there, but something harder was showing through it now, like stone under a layer of topsoil. Maybe, Olivia said, but it's my mistake to make. I have resources you don't, Hale said. I have relationships in this industry. I have legal capacity you can't match. If you force this into a public confrontation, you'll do what, she said. Another pause. I'll protect my business, he said, the same way any person protects what they built. What you've built, Olivia said, and for the first time she let something into her voice. Not anger, not heat, but the specific cold certainty of a woman who has been sitting with 30 years of injustice for 5 weeks and has finished grieving it and moved into something past grief. My father built it. He taught me how it was built. He sealed the evidence inside the machine he knew I'd find, and I found it, and I'm going to finish what he started. She paused. I'd recommend you focus on your build, Mr. Hale, because whatever you submit in December is going to be standing next to mine, and mine is going to be better. She ended the call. She stood in the quiet shop with her heart going hard in her chest. Not fear, something else. Something that felt like the moment a stalled engine finally catches and runs. She breathed through it. She let it settle. Then she picked up her tool and went back to work. She was there until 2 in the morning, and the things she built in those 3 hours were some of the finest work she'd ever done. The hands steady and certain in a way they hadn't been since before her father got sick. She didn't notice until she was about to leave that she'd been crying for the last hour. Not the kind that happens when something that's been held too tight for too long finally gets room to breathe. She wiped her face on her sleeve and turned off the lights and went home. 7 weeks left. The letter from Hale's lawyers arrived on a Monday. Olivia was in the shop when Jack brought it in a thick envelope, cream-colored with a Phoenix return address, and the name of a firm she didn't recognize, printed in the upper left corner, with the quiet confidence of an institution that had never needed to advertise. Jack set it on the workbench beside her without comment. She looked at it for a moment, then set down her tool and opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the workbench and went back to what she'd been doing. Well, Jack said. Cease and desist, she said. They're claiming the build constitutes unfair competition and misappropriation of Velocity Customs' proprietary design identity. They're also claiming that my use of the documents constitutes, she glanced back at the letter, tortious interference with established business relationships and reputational interests. What does that mean in plain language? It means his lawyers are creative, Olivia said. It means he told them to come up with something that sounded serious enough to scare me, and they did their job. Is it serious? She considered the question honestly, the way her father had always considered questions, not looking for the answer she wanted, but the one that was actually there. The misappropriation claim is thin, she said. The documents are my father's. I inherited them. Using them as the basis for my own build is not misappropriation of Hale's anything, it's the opposite. The tortious interference language is broader and messier, and that's intentional. It's meant to be expensive to respond to, not necessarily winnable. He's trying to tie you up in legal costs, Jack said. He's trying to make me calculate that the fight costs more than the win is worth, Olivia said. She picked her tool back up. He miscalculated. You don't have money for lawyers, Jack said. Not unkind, just accurate. I know, she said. Roy mentioned someone, a woman in Tucson who does intellectual property work. She's done pro bono cases before when the facts were right. The facts are right here, Jack said. I think so too, Olivia said. I need her to agree. She called the lawyer that evening. Her name was Sandra Voss, and she had the focused telephone manner of someone who received a great many calls from people who wanted things and had learned to assess quickly which calls deserved her full attention. Olivia gave her the facts in order, the partnership, the split the documents, Keene's assessment, the bill to cease and desist, and was 5 minutes into it when Voss interrupted her. Stop, Voss said. How old are the documents? Oldest ones are dated 1988, Olivia said, and they establish your father as the originating designer of the aesthetic and engineering principles that Velocity Customs' current work is built on. Yes, Dr. Arthur Keene at U of A has reviewed them and will put that in writing. Arthur Keene, Voss said, and there was a pause. I know his work. He's credible. He's genuinely credible. Another pause. And the cease and desist they sent, do you have it in front of you? Yes. Read me the language around the design identity claim. Olivia read it. Voss was quiet for a moment. They're trying to preempt you, Voss said. They know the documentation is real. This letter is not from a lawyer who believes his client has a strong case. This is from a lawyer who's been told to create delay and cost because the client understands that the facts aren't on his side. Her voice had shifted, the assessment quality replaced by something more energized. I want to see the documents. Can you be in Tucson Wednesday? Yes, Olivia said. Bring everything. Originals, not copies. And the Keene letter if he's drafted it. He has, Olivia said. Good, Voss said. Don't respond to the cease and desist before we talk. Don't communicate with Hale or his people directly. And don't tell anyone outside your immediate circle about this conversation. Understood, Olivia said. One more thing, Voss said, and her voice had an edge that Olivia hadn't heard before, something that sounded like controlled indignation. How long did Hale run this business before your father's name disappeared from the record entirely? About 30 years, Olivia said. Voss made a sound that was short and sharp and not quite a word. Then Wednesday, 8 in the morning. Don't be late. She wasn't late. She arrived at Voss's office at 7:55 and spent 4 hours going through the documents with a woman who turned out to be one of the most precise thinkers Olivia had encountered. The kind of precision that doesn't announce itself, that you only recognize by watching someone work, by seeing how they handle a complex set of facts and find the load-bearing elements without being told where to look. By noon, Voss had a clear picture. Here's what you have, she said, sitting back with her coffee. You have dated documentation establishing original creative authorship. You have credible expert assessment connecting that documentation to Velocity Customs' current work. You have a paper trail from the partnership, the contracts, the letters that shows a restructuring that, while arguably legal on its face, was conducted in a way that a reasonable person could characterize as predatory. She paused. Here's what you don't have. You don't have a direct evidentiary link proving that Hale currently has copies of your father's designs. You can demonstrate parallel creative logic, which Keene's letter addresses. You can demonstrate that the design language originates with your father. But proving that Hale actively accessed those specific documents rather than arrived at similar conclusions through his own work, that's harder. He didn't arrive at it independently, Olivia said. The Meridian uses 3 specific structural solutions that are in my father's drawings in forms that are not generic. They're specific. You'd have to arrive at them deliberately. Keene says so in his letter. Yes, in those terms. That's going to matter, Voss said. But I want to be honest with you about the litigation landscape. A direct IP lawsuit against Velocity Custom is a long game. Hale has resources. He'll fight every discovery request. Various and procedural motions make it expensive and slow. Even with a good case, we're looking at years and significant cost. She looked at Olivia directly. That's one path. What's the other path? Olivia said. The competition, Voss said. If you submit that build and you establish publicly in front of the judges, the press, the people in that community who know the history that the creative origin of both builds is the same man, and that man is not Marcus Hale, you change the public narrative. You make the story undeniable. And once the story is public and credible, the legal fight looks different. Hale loses leverage. His relationships in the industry become a liability rather than an asset. His lawyers start asking him harder questions about what their exposure looks like. So the competition isn't just symbolic, Olivia said. The competition, Voss said carefully, is the most powerful legal tool you have right now, because it's not a legal tool, it's a truth tool. And truth delivered in the right room to the right people at the right moment does things that litigation can't. Olivia drove back to Ridgecrest and told Jack what Voss had said. Jack listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him, the way he created space for a full report before he responded. So we finished the build, he said when she was done. We finished the build, she said, and we document everything. Voss wants a complete photographic and written record of the construction process, every stage, every decision, reference back to the drawings, every component choice tied to the original specifications. When that motorcycle rolls into the competition hall, she wants it to be possible to trace every single element of it back to my father's hand. That's a lot of documentation alongside a build on an 11-week timeline, Jack said. I know, she said. I'm going to need help with the documentation side. I can't do both. I'll do it, said a voice from the corner of the shop. She turned. Roy Decker was sitting on a stool in the corner with a mug of coffee, and she'd forgotten he was there, which was apparently something Roy could make happen without trying very hard. "I've been doing this kind of record keeping since before you were born," Roy said. "Process documentation for builds. I know what it needs to look like to be taken seriously by people who know the field." He paused. "I knew your father's work from the beginning. I can narrate the connection between what's in those drawings and what I'm watching come together in this shop. That's the documentation Voss needs. Someone who was there at the start and is here at the end." Olivia looked at him. "You'd go on record publicly. Your father asked us to stay out of his civilian dispute 30 years ago," Roy said. "He's not here to ask me to stay out of this one." He drank his coffee. "I'm going on record." She didn't say thank you. It would have been insufficient. She nodded once and Roy nodded back, and that was the whole conversation. But it was also somehow the most substantial conversation she'd had since this started. The next problem arrived 4 days later and came from a direction she hadn't expected. Of the junior competition organizers, a man named Freed, who handled entry administration for the Southwest Circuit, called to tell her that a question had been raised about her entry. Specifically a question about whether she met the eligibility criteria for the master builder category she'd entered under. The criteria required documented evidence of prior competition-level builds or professional recognition in the field. "I rebuilt a 1976 Electroglide from near total dereliction," she said. "Full engine rebuild, complete electrical restoration, fuel system frame treatment." "That would be restoration category," Freed said. He sounded uncomfortable, like a man delivering a message he'd been asked to deliver and didn't love the assignment. "The master builder category requires original design work." "The build I've submitted for December is original design work," she said, "based on original design documentation that I've registered with the entry." "The question being raised," Freed said carefully, "is whether the design documentation you've submitted represents your original work or your father's. The entry rules specify that the design must be the entrant's own original creative work." The room felt very still. "Who raised the question?" she said. Freed paused. "I'm not at liberty to—" "Was it Marcus Hale?" she said. The pause was a half-second too long. "I'm not able to speak to the source of eligibility inquiries," Freed said. "I'm only able to tell you that the question has been raised and the organizing committee has asked for a clarification response within 5 business days." She called Voss before she'd finished the conversation with Freed. Voss had the response drafted by the next morning. It was 12 pages long, and it was in Olivia's assessment, a document that had been constructed with the specific intention of making any further interference with her entry so legally and procedurally costly that the organizing committee would find it considerably easier to accept her entry and move on. The core argument was elegant: the design origin attribution question Hale had raised, if pursued, would require the committee to investigate Velocity Custom's own design provenance, a process that would inevitably surface the same documentation Olivia had submitted, positioned now not as a challenge to her eligibility, but as evidence of Hale's. The committee could either accept both entries and let the public presentation speak for itself, or they could open an investigation that would not end where Hale expected it to end. Freed called back on day 3 of the 5. The entry was confirmed. No further eligibility questions would be raised. Olivia received that call in the shop with 4 weeks left in the build at approximately 70% completion. She'd told Jack. Jack's expression did not change, but something in his posture released slightly, the way a person's shoulders drop when they've been holding against a weight that has just been removed. "Keep building," he said. "That was always the plan," she said. "The last 4 weeks were the hardest and the best weeks of the build. The hardest because the work at this stage was unforgiving. The finish, decisions, the assembly, precision, the calibration of every system, the kind of work where the accumulated quality of everything that came before either shows or doesn't, where you can't compensate for early errors with later excellence because the early work is now inside the later work and permanent. The best because she could see it. She could see the thing her father had drawn in the drawings taking shape in the physical world. The design language she'd grown up hearing described becoming metal in line and proportion. And there were moments while she worked, usually late, usually alone, usually with the shop quiet around her, when the presence of what she was doing had a weight to it that she couldn't quite describe. She was finishing something her father had started, not as his surrogate, not as his representative, as herself as a builder in her own right, with her own hands and her own understanding, carrying the inheritance he'd left her not as a burden, but as a foundation. Dale Pruitt told her in week 9 that it was the best fabrication work he'd been part of in 20 years. He said it matter-of-factly, without the inflation of a compliment, the way he said most things as a simple statement of his assessment of the facts. She believed him. Carter Webb started on the finish in week 10 and worked in a way that she could only describe as consecrated, the same word her father had used once, about a mechanic he particularly admired, meaning someone who brought the quality of attention to their work that most people reserve for the things they considered sacred. Carter understood what the finish needed to say, and he said it with a sureness of hand that made the motorcycle look, as it emerged from his process, like something that had always been meant to exist and was only now arriving. Roy documented everything. He moved through the shop, quietly photographing stages, making notes in a system he'd developed over decades, writing the narrative that connected what was happening in the build to what was in the drawings, to what had been in her father's hands and mind 30 years ago. He interviewed Dale and Pam and Carter. He wrote Olivia's own testimony down, with her permission, the story of how she'd found the motorcycle and what she'd found inside it, and it read, when she saw the draft, like something that was true in more dimensions than just factual. The motorcycle was finished on a Wednesday evening, 4 days before the competition. She stood back from it, for the first time really stood back. Not the step back to assess the next problem version, but the fully back arms at her sides, nothing left to do version, and looked at the complete thing for the first time. The shop had filled up without her noticing. Jack was there, Roy, Dale still in his work clothes, Pam with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who had delivered her best work and knew it. Carter standing slightly apart, the way artists sometimes stand from finished things, not quite ready to fully separate from the process. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Dale said, Thomas would know what this was. It was the most precise thing anyone could have said. Olivia felt it go through her like something physical. He'd know, she said. Roy was already on the phone with Voss. The documentation package, photographs, narrative expert, assessments, construction records, Providence Trail was complete and had been shared with 3 motorcycle publications whose editors Roy had relationships with and had reached out to quietly over the preceding 2 weeks. The publications had not yet run anything. They were waiting. Roy had asked them to wait, and they'd agreed, because Roy had told them that the story would be better if they waited, and that when it broke, it would be worth the patience. The competition was in Albuquerque. They loaded the motorcycle Thursday morning, carefully, with the precision of people who understood that what they were transporting represented more than its physical weight. Jack rode his bike. Most of the chapter rode. There were 23 motorcycles on the highway when they pulled out of Ridgecrest, and the sight of them in her mirrors, the sound of them, the specific, sustained thunder of 23 machines moving together with intention, was something she felt in her chest in a way she didn't have words for. She drove the truck with the motorcycle in the trailer. Roy rode beside her. She'd been awake since 4, not from anxiety, or not only from anxiety, from the particular alertness that comes when you know that a long period of effort is about to arrive at its moment, that everything you've built is about to be put in front of the world, and the world is going to respond in the way it responds, and you've done everything you could do to be ready for that response. She thought about Marcus Hale arriving in Albuquerque. She thought about him seeing the entry list and finding her name on it. She thought about what he would feel when he understood that the cease and desist had not worked, that the eligibility challenge had not worked, that the phone call in the night had not worked, and that she was here anyway, with the build completed and the documentation filed, and 31 people from Ridgecrest, Arizona riding behind her truck, because they had decided that Thomas Bennett's daughter deserved to have people at her back. She thought about her father sealing those drawings inside a motorcycle frame. A young man, 29 years old, cleaning out a shop that was no longer his, taking the one thing he could take, putting it somewhere he believed was safe, planning even in that moment of loss for something beyond the loss, trusting in some version of the future that he couldn't fully see. She reached over and touched the oilskin package on the passenger seat. She'd kept it with her every day since she found it. She'd carry it into that competition hall. She'd put it next to the motorcycle. She'd let anyone who wanted to look at her father's handwriting look at it, and she'd let the same people look at what she'd built, and she'd let them draw the conclusions that 30 years of silence had prevented them from drawing. "You okay?" Roy said through the window of her truck. He dropped his speed to match hers on the open highway. She thought about the question. "I'm good," she said. Roy looked at her for a moment, then looked at the road ahead. "Your father was afraid of this fight," he said. "He told me once, not long before he came to Ridgecrest, before you were born. He said he was afraid that if he fought it, he'd spend so much of himself on the fighting that he'd forget how to build. He said he didn't want to become someone whose whole life was about what someone took from him." Olivia absorbed this. "He made a different choice," she said. "He made the choice he could make at 29 with no money and no lawyer, and a man threatening him from a position of power," Roy said. "You're making the choice you can make at 24 with his documentation and Voss and Keene and a chapter behind you." He looked at her. Different position, different choice. Both of them are right for what they were. She kept her eyes on the road. The desert moved past on both sides, the particular January light of the southwest flat and clear, making everything very sharp, very present. "If it doesn't work," she said, "if the judges don't see it, or the press doesn't pick it up the way Roy thinks they will, or Hale's lawyers find a way to cloud the story, then we go to Plan B," Roy said. "What's Plan B?" "Haven't made it yet," Roy said, "but there'll be one." She almost laughed. It came out as something more complicated, relief maybe, or the recognition that having people who would figure out Plan B with you was a thing of actual value, a thing she hadn't had for a long time before this started. They arrived in Albuquerque in the late afternoon. The competition hall was a large venue. She'd looked it up, but looking it up hadn't prepared her for the physical reality of it, the scale of the thing, the number of vehicles in the lot, the quality of the people moving in and out of the entrance. This was not a regional hobby event. This was serious. The builders here were serious. The press presence was already visible. She recognized the equipment, the credentials on lanyards, the particular purposeful movement of people who were here to capture something rather than simply witness it. She unloaded the motorcycle herself. She didn't ask for help with that part. Some things you needed to do yourself. She rolled it through the entrance and found her assigned space and positioned it and stepped back. And then Marcus Hale walked through the door on the other side of the hall. She recognized him from photographs, heavier now than in the old pictures, well-dressed in the specific way of a man who had spent decades learning how money was supposed to look. He was with two other men, one of whom she recognized as the kind of person who is always described as a representative without it ever being quite clear what they represent. His eyes moved across the hall with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing the competitive landscape, cataloging, measuring, calculating. His eyes found her motorcycle. She watched him stop. Not a dramatic stop. He didn't freeze, didn't react in any visible way that someone standing far away would have caught. But she was not standing far away, and she saw the moment his brain caught up to what his eyes were showing him. The slight recalibration, the quality of attention that shifted from survey to focus. He looked at the motorcycle for a long time. Then he looked for her. She was standing beside it, and she didn't look away when he found her. They looked at each other across the length of the competition hall. All the things that existed between them. The 30 years, the drawings, the sealed frame, the letter, the phone call in the night, the lawyers, the road from Ridgecrest to here, all of it compressed into the space of that look. Hale turned to the man beside him and said something. The man looked at his phone. Then the man looked up with an expression that told Olivia something had just happened. Some piece of information had arrived that was unwelcome. She had a guess about what piece of information it was. Roy had called her at 7 that morning to tell her that 2 of the publications had decided not to wait after all. The documentation package had been too complete to sit on. The story was running. She watched Hale take his phone from his pocket and look at the screen. She watched him understand. The hall was filling up around them. Builders' judges pressed the assembled community of people for whom this event was the year's most significant gathering. The motorcycle her father had designed and she had built was standing in that hall. The documentation of its origin was in the hands of journalists who were writing about it in real time. Dr. Keene's letter was public. Roy's construction narrative was public. The dated drawings were being reproduced in 2 publications that between them reached every person who cared about this field. Marcus Hale looked up from his phone. Olivia held his gaze. She was 24 years old and she had $46 in her father's hands and 31 people from Ridgecrest who had ridden all the way here because they understood that some things were worth the distance. She didn't move toward him. She didn't need to. She stood beside the motorcycle and let the room do what the room was going to do. The first journalist reached her within 10 minutes of Hale walking away. She'd watched him go, watched him take his phone and his representative and his 2 decades of cultivated composure and move toward the far side of the hall where the Velocity custom entry was staged, and she'd watched the way he moved, which was not the movement of a man who had just won something, but the movement of a man who was recalculating in real time while trying not to let the recalculation show. She'd seen that quality of movement before. Her father had described it once, talking about something else entirely, not about Hale, not about the business, just a general observation about people under pressure. When someone's plan stops working, you can see it in how they walk before you can see it in their face. The journalist was a woman in her mid-30s named Dana Marsh, with the credential of a publication Olivia recognized from Roy's list, one of the two that had broken the story that morning. She introduced herself briefly the way people do when they know that the introduction is a formality and the real conversation is what they're both actually there for. "The documentation package your team released this morning," Dana said. She had her recorder out, held low, not in Olivia's face. A professional courtesy. "Have you seen Hale's response yet?" "No," Olivia said. "Has there been one?" "His publicist sent a statement about 20 minutes ago," Dana said. "I can read it to you if you want. Short version, he's characterizing this as a misunderstanding about the nature of creative influence and shared creative environments. He says your father was a valued collaborator whose contributions he has always acknowledged privately, and he wishes your family well." The phrasing landed exactly the way Olivia suspected it had been designed to land a denial that wasn't quite a denial, an acknowledgement that conceded nothing. Language that had been constructed to create ambiguity rather than clarity. "He acknowledged my father privately," Olivia said. "That's the language," Dana said. 30 years of private acknowledgement," Olivia said, "and not one public credit, not one mention of Thomas Bennett's name in any interview, any publication feature, any press release." She looked at Dana directly. "You've read the documentation, you've read Keene's assessment. What did Dr. Keene say about the creative origin of the design system?" "He said unambiguously that the design system reflected in both the documents and the Bennett build has a single point of origin," Dana said. "Your father's work beginning in 1988. Then the question of private versus public acknowledgement is answered by 30 years of public record," Olivia said, "which contains exactly one name, and it isn't Thomas Bennett." Dana wrote something. "The judges do the formal walkthrough in 2 hours," she said. "After that, the floor opens to the public. I'm going to be here all day." "So am I," Olivia said. The next 2 hours had the quality of a long-held breath. The hall continued filling, builders making final adjustments, judges arriving with the particular self-contained energy of people who have a serious job to do and are doing it, press moving through the space with their equipment and their credentials in the broader community of people who came to this event every year and had opinions about everything and were not shy about expressing them. Roy materialized at her elbow about 40 minutes in, carrying 2 coffees, and handed her one without being asked. "Have you seen the online response to the story?" he said. "I've been avoiding my phone," she said. "Stop avoiding it," Roy said. She looked. The documentation package had been shared widely, more widely than she'd expected, though Roy appeared to have expected it based on the absence of surprise in his expression. The people sharing it were not all motorcycle community insiders. Some of them were, but the story had traveled beyond that specific community into something broader, into the territory of stories about creative theft and family legacy and the specific kind of injustice that people recognize immediately because it rhymes with something they've seen before. The comments were running 3-to-1 in a direction she could only describe as unambiguous. "Hale's people are pushing back in the comments," Roy said. "Of course they are," she said. "It's not working," Roy said. "When you push back against something that has documentation attached to it, you just draw more attention to the documentation." She pocketed her phone. "Where's Jack?" "Talking to 2 of the judges," Roy said. "Informally, not about the competition. He knows them from years back. He's not lobbying, he's just being present in a way that makes it clear he's here and paying attention. She understood the distinction. Jack's presence at a conversation was itself a form of communication. It didn't require him to say anything specific. And Hale, Roy glanced across the hall. He's been on his phone for 40 minutes. His representative is doing a lot of walking around having conversations in low voices. Roy sipped his coffee. The Meridian is a beautiful motorcycle, he said. I wanted to be honest about that. It's well built. The finish work is excellent. The design is strong. I know, Olivia said. Which is why this matters, Roy said. If it were mediocre, it would just be theft. Because it's good, the question of where it came from carries weight. People want to know how it became good. They want to understand the source of that quality. The source is my father, she said. Yes, Roy said, and that's what the documentation shows. And that's what Keene's letter says. And that's what people are reading this morning. He paused. And that's what they're going to see when they stand next to your build and read the placard and look at the drawings and understand that what your father envisioned in 1980 is standing in this hall in complete form for the first time. The judge's walkthrough began at 11. There were 5 of them. She'd researched them in advance, the way you research anything that matters, because understanding who is making a decision is as important as understanding the decision itself. 2 were builders with long competition records. 1 was an automotive design historian with credentials that overlapped with Keene's world. 1 was a longtime industry editor whose publication had not been part of Roy's release, but had picked up the story secondhand by this morning. The 5th was a woman named Grace Abernathy who had been judging this competition for 16 years and who was by reputation the most technically rigorous of the panel. They moved through the hall, systematically spending time at each entry. She watched them from a distance when they weren't at her station, trying to read what she could from body language and the quality of their attention. She was not good at waiting. She had never been good at waiting. She dealt with it the way she dealt with most things, by focusing on what she could control, which was the presentation of the work and the information available to anyone who came to look at it. Roy had prepared the display material. The documentation, the drawings reproduced at readable scale and mounted in a way that made the connection between the 1980 originals and the finished motorcycle clear without being didactic about it. Dr. Keene's assessment was available in full. The construction record was there. Her father's photograph, the one from the competition in the early 90s, the grin, the trophy was there. She'd placed it herself the morning they'd set up. She'd held it for a moment before she put it down. She'd said something to him very quietly that she wasn't going to repeat to anyone. Then she'd put it where people could see it. Grace Abernathy reached her station first, slightly ahead of the other judges. She was a compact woman in her 60s with close-cropped silver hair and the physical economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. She looked at the motorcycle for approximately 90 seconds before she said anything. This is the Bennett build, she said. Yes, Olivia said. You built this? Yes. From these drawings. Not accusatory, precise. From these drawings, Olivia confirmed. My father developed the design system. I executed the build according to his specifications with my own interpretations in the areas where the drawings indicated flexibility. Abernathy moved around the motorcycle, slowly looking at specific points that told Olivia she understood the technical choices being made. She wasn't looking at the surface. She was looking at the decisions underneath the surface. She crouched down and looked at the frame junction at the rear, the exact spot where Olivia had spent 3 days with Dale, getting the fabrication exactly right, because it was the structural articulation of the core design principle, the thing that made everything else in the geometry work. This junction, Abernathy said, this is in the drawings. Page 7, Olivia said. Roy had the drawings organized. He produced page 7. Abernathy looked at it. She looked at the motorcycle. She looked at the drawing again. 1988, she said, reading the date in the corner. Yes, Olivia said. Abernathy stood up. She looked at the photograph of Thomas Bennett. She looked at Olivia. Something moved across her face, a complex expression that Olivia couldn't fully decode, which contained respect, and something that might have been anger at something that had nothing to do with Olivia directly. The Meridian, Abernathy said carefully, uses a very similar structural solution at that junction. Yes, Olivia said, it does. Abernathy was quiet for a moment. I've been looking at Velocity Customs work for 15 years, she said. I know Marcus Hale's design sensibility, or I thought I did. She looked at the drawing again. This is not his sensibility. I can see that now. I should have seen it before. You didn't have the context before, Olivia said. No, Abernathy said. I didn't. She stepped back. The other judges had arrived at the station. She spoke to them briefly in low tones, and Olivia watched three of them react to whatever she said, with the micro-expressions of people receiving information that is reorganizing something for them. The historian, the man whose work overlapped with Keene's, picked up page 7 and held it next to his phone where he'd apparently pulled up something. He looked between them for a long moment. Then he set the drawing down and looked at Olivia. Did Arthur Keene see the meridian alongside these documents? He asked. He saw competition photographs, Olivia said. His assessment is in the packet. I know Keene's work, the man said. I trust his eye. He looked at Roy. Is this the complete documentation or is there additional material? Complete as of today, Roy said. There may be additional letters that provide further context. We've been conservative about what we included because we wanted everything presented to be fully verified. Conservative, the man said, and the word had a quality of professional appreciation in it. All right, the judges moved on. She watched them reach the Velocity Customs Station, which was at the far end of the hall. She watched them spend time there. She couldn't read the distance. She stopped trying and went back to talking to the people who came to her station. Builders enthusiasts. The press people who had read the story that morning and wanted to see the build in person. People who had known of Thomas Bennett's work by reputation and were now putting together pieces they hadn't known were pieces before. A man came in the early afternoon who stopped in front of the motorcycle and didn't say anything for a long time. He was in his 70s with the lean, weathered quality of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors and working with his hands. He looked at the motorcycle the way Dale had looked at it, the way of someone who understood what they were looking at a technical level and was reading it that way. Then he looked at the photograph. He stood very still. You're Thomas's daughter, he said. Yes, she said. I competed against him, the man said. 1991, Phoenix show. He had a build that year. Everyone in the room knew it was the best thing there. He didn't win. He paused. The judging that year were questions. He looked at the photograph again. I always wondered what happened to him. He just disappeared from the circuit after that. He walked away from the business, Olivia said. He came to Ridgecrest. He opened a small shop. He raised me. Did he talk about it, the old work? Never, she said. Not once, the man shook his head slowly. That must have cost him something, he said. I think it cost him a great deal, Olivia said. I think he decided it was worth it to let it go, to not be someone whose whole life was organized around what had been taken from him. She paused. I made a different calculation. The man looked at her, then he looked at the motorcycle. Then he put out his hand. Bill Carver, he said, I'm testifying if you need me to. I have 30 years of notes from every competition I've attended. I have documentation of your father's 1991 build. He paused. I've been waiting for someone to ask. She shook his hand. I might need you to, she said. The results were announced at 4 in the afternoon. The hall had been building toward it for hours. The specific energy of a group of people who are all waiting for the same moment and can feel it approaching. The press had gathered near the front. Builders had moved in from their stations. The chapter from Ridgecrest had arranged themselves in a loose group near her station, not conspicuously, not in a way that looked like anything organized. Just 23 people who happened to be standing near each other in the way that people who know each other well end up standing near each other. She stood beside the motorcycle. Jack was to her left, Roy to her right. She hadn't asked them to stand there. They'd appeared. The chief judge, one of the builder judges, a man named Harlan Briggs, who had been doing this for 20 years, stepped to the front and spoke about the competition, about the quality of the field, about what this event represented to the custom motorcycle community. She heard it without fully registering the words. She was watching Hale, who was standing near the Velocity Customs Station, with his arms at his sides and his expression controlled, and his representative beside him, doing what they'd been doing all day, being present and composed and giving nothing away. She understood him in that moment more than she would have expected to. Not sympathetically, but clearly. He was a man who had built 30 years of professional identity on a foundation that wasn't his, and the thing he'd feared most had arrived, and he was standing in it with the only tools he had left, which were composure and legal resources, and the relationships he'd spent 3 decades cultivating. She could see the calculation happening in real time, what could still be managed, what couldn't, where the exposure was greatest, how to minimize it. She felt no satisfaction in that reading. It was just information. Briggs announced the awards in reverse order. Third place went to a builder from Colorado whose work she'd admired when she first walked the floor. Second place announcement came and her name was not in it, and she felt something in her chest contract sharply. Not a collapse, but a recognition that this was the moment that second place would be the answer, and the answer would be what it was. Briggs paused before the first place announcement. He looked at his notes, or appeared to. He looked at the room. The top award this year, he said, goes to a build that the judging panel discussed for longer than any entry in recent memory. Not because of uncertainty about the quality of the work that was unambiguous, but because of the questions the work raised that went beyond the category of craft alone into questions about history and attribution and what we owe to the full story of where great work comes from. Olivia's hands were very still at her sides. First place Southwest Circuit Championship Master Builder category, the Bennett build, Thomas and Olivia Bennett. The sound in the hall was complicated. It wasn't pure applause. It was applause with texture, with different registers coming from different directions, some of it immediate and full, some of it more considered, some of it from people who were processing while they clapped what they had just heard the judge say both names, her father's and hers, together publicly in a room full of the people who had been hearing only one name for 30 years. She didn't move right away. She stood beside the motorcycle and let the sound come at her, and kept her hands still and her face still and breathed. Jack said very quietly and only to her, "Go." She walked to the front. Briggs handed her the award, physical, heavy, the weight of an object that meant something, and she held it and looked at the room and found the faces she was looking for: Roy, Dale, Pam, Carter, the Ridgecrest chapter, Bill Carver near the back, who raised his chin in a small nod that carried the weight of 30 years of a story being corrected. And then she found Hale. I was still standing near his station. His representative had gone somewhere she didn't see him in her scan of the room. Hale was alone, his arms at his sides, watching her. His expression had the quality of a man who has just watched something he spent a long time preventing happen anyway and is in the early stage of understanding that the preventing is over and the next chapter has already begun. She looked at him for exactly as long as felt right. Long enough for it to be a look and not a glance, not so long that it became something else. She was not interested in punishing him in this moment. She was interested in the truth being visible, clearly and permanently in this room on this day. Then she looked away. She looked at Briggs. "I want to say something," she said. He handed her the microphone. She hadn't prepared remarks. She'd thought about this moment and deliberately not prepared for it, because prepared remarks had a quality of performance that she didn't want. She wanted to say what was true and let it be as simple as what was true. "My father's name is Thomas Bennett," she said. "He built motorcycles in the late 80s and early 90s that people in this room remember. Some of you competed against him. Some of you saw his work and wondered where it went. What happened to Thomas Bennett is documented now. The story is out there and you can read it if you want the details." She paused. "What I want to say is that this award has two names on it because that's the truth of it. The design is his, the build is mine. I couldn't have built it without what he taught me, which was everything I know about machines and about patience and about the difference between a thing that's broken and a thing that just needs someone to believe in it." Another pause. The room was very quiet. He didn't live to see this, but I think he knew something like this was coming. I think that's why he left me the drawings. I think he was betting on me to finish it, and I want him to know that I did. She handed the microphone back. The applause this time was different, fuller, the kind that comes from a room that has been moved rather than a room that is being polite. She walked back to the motorcycle and put her hand on the tank that Dale had fabricated, and Carter had finished the tank that sat on the frame, that executed her father's geometry. The whole thing exactly what the drawing said it should be, and exactly what she'd made it, and she stood there while the room came to her. Dana Marsh was first, then the design historian, then Bill Carver, then a line of people she didn't know who knew her father's work, or who had read the story that morning, or who simply understood from what they'd seen today that something that had been wrong for a long time had been partially corrected, and who wanted to be near that correction. Hale left an hour after the announcement. She saw him go, saw his representative reappear, and the two of them move toward the exit together with the particular efficiency of people executing a departure that has been decided rather than chosen. He didn't come to her station. He didn't approach her. She hadn't expected him to. Voss called at 5:30. "I saw the announcement," she said. "The press coverage is significant. 2 more publications have picked up the story in the last 2 hours. I've had a call from Hale's lawyers." "Already," Olivia said. "They want to talk," Voss said. "His senior counsel, not the cease and desist people." "Senior counsel. That's a different conversation." "What do they want to talk about?" "They didn't specify," Voss said. "But senior counsel calling within 2 hours of a public event that went the way this one did, that's not a call about continuing a fight. That's a call about terms." She paused. "I want you to understand what that means. It doesn't mean he's admitting anything. It means he's calculating, and the calculation has changed." "What do you want to do?" Olivia said. "I want to take the meeting," Voss said. "I want to hear what they're offering, and I want you to understand that whatever they offer you, don't have to take it. You have options. The documentation is public. The competition result is public. Keene's letter is public. If Hale wants to fight this in court now, he's doing it on terrain that is significantly less favorable to him than it was this morning." "Set up the meeting," Olivia said. "There's one more thing," Voss said. Her voice had changed slightly. The professional precision was still there, but something else had come into it, something more personal. "Before I got the call from Hale's people, I got a call from the Motorcycle Heritage Foundation. They'd seen the story, and they've seen the documentation. They want to discuss a formal restoration of Thomas Bennett's historical record, his work from the late 80s and early 90s listed under his name in their archival records." She paused. "It's not money, it's not legal remedy, but it means that 30 years from now, when someone looks up the history of custom motorcycle design in that era, they'll find his name where it belongs." Olivia stood very still. She was holding the award in one hand and her phone in the other, and the hall was still loud around her with people and conversation and the specific energy of an event winding down. And she felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time, something that she'd thought maybe she'd lost permanently when her father got sick, something she hadn't known she was still waiting to feel. "Yes," she said, "tell them yes." The chapter from Ridgecrest rode home the next morning. She rode with them this time. Not in the truck, in the line on the Harley, the 76 Electra Glide that had started all of this, the motorcycle she'd bought for $46 and rebuilt in a rented garage, and that had led her here to this specific morning on a highway in New Mexico with 23 people around her and an award in the trailer and her father's name in the public record for the first time in 30 years. She rode in the middle of the group, which was where Jack had put her and where she'd stayed without arguing. The sound of the bikes around her was the sound she'd come to associate with solidity, with the specific kind of reliability that comes from people who have made a decision about what matters and acted on it. Jack pulled up beside her on the open road. She looked over at him. "How do you feel?" he asked. It was loud enough that he had to raise his voice over the wind and the engines. She thought about the question honestly the way her father had taught her to think about questions. "Like something's been finished," she said. Jack nodded. He dropped back into his position. She rode. The meeting with Hale's senior counsel happened 3 weeks later in Voss's office in Tucson. Olivia sat across from a man named Geller, who had the smooth, measured quality of someone who negotiated for a living and had learned not to let anything show that wasn't intended to show. Voss sat beside her, equally measured, equally prepared, and Olivia had the specific comfort of a person who has put themselves in the right hands. Geller made an offer. It was carefully structured. No admission of wrongdoing, language engineered to create plausible deniability. A financial component that Voss had told her in advance would be lower than the case was worth and higher than what Hale thought he'd be paying 6 months ago. There was also a provision for attribution, a public acknowledgement of Thomas Bennett's contribution to Velocity Customs' foundational design work, framed in language that Geller presented as generous, and that Voss had told her in their prep meeting was the minimum they should accept. Olivia listened to the full presentation. She asked 2 questions, both technical, both about the attribution language specifically. Geller answered them with the care of a man who understood that she was not going to be managed easily. Then she looked at Voss. Voss gave her a very small nod. The nod meant we can do better on the numbers, but the attribution language is what you came for, and it's here. I want one addition to the attribution language, Olivia said. Geller looked at her. I want the acknowledgement to include the dates, she said. Not Thomas Bennett's foundational contributions in the abstract. The specific language should reflect that the design system originated in documentation dated from 1988 through 1993. The dates matter. The dates are the truth. Geller glanced at someone beside him, another lawyer junior there to take notes. Something passed between them. We can work with that, Geller said. Then we have the basis for an agreement, Voss said. We'll want the language in final form before we sign anything. Walking out of that building, Olivia stood on the sidewalk in the January cold of Tucson and called Roy. It's done, she said. All of it, Roy said. The attribution, she said. With the dates, his name, his dates, his design system. In Velocity Customs' official record. She paused. He took a lot from my father. He can't give most of it back. But he's giving back the name. That was the thing that mattered most. Roy was quiet for a moment. Your father would have had feelings about this, he said. I know, she said. Complicated ones. He'd have been proud of the result and uncomfortable about how it was achieved and grateful it was over, and probably would have spent 2 weeks not talking much about any of it. Sounds about right, Roy said. Roy, she said. Yeah. Thank you, she said, for being there from the beginning, for knowing his work, for showing up. She paused, for deciding that 30 years was long enough. Roy made a sound, not quite a word, but she heard everything in it. Your father was our brother, Roy said. What we did, it wasn't for you. It was for him, and it was for what's right. You just gave us a way to do it. He paused. You gave us more than that, actually. You gave us proof that it was still possible. She opened the shop in Ridgecrest that spring. Not a large operation, a single building on the east side of town, well equipped because the chapter had contributed what she couldn't afford, run by herself and 2 employees who had found her through the story and come looking for work with the specific energy of people who wanted to be part of something rather than just employed somewhere. She did restoration work and custom consultation, and she took on 2 apprentices in the first year, both of them young, both of them people who reminded her of herself at an age when she hadn't known yet what her hands were for. She kept the old $46 Harley in the center of the shop floor. Not behind glass, not as a display piece. Just there in the space, present the way something is present when it belongs somewhere. People who came in would often stop and look at it and sometimes ask, and she would tell them as much or as little as the conversation called for. The motorcycle her father had designed and she had built was on a longer journey. It traveled to 2 more competitions in the year after Albuquerque and won both. And then it went to the Heritage Foundation's collection on permanent loan, where it was documented and displayed alongside the attribution that bore both names, father and daughter, and the dates that were the truth. One afternoon in late autumn, nearly a year after Albuquerque, Jack Donovan came by the shop. He didn't call ahead. He walked in and looked at the space and the work happening in it and the old Harley in the center of the floor. And he nodded slowly in the way of a man who is measuring something against a standard and finding that it meets it. He sat on a stool and drank the coffee she brought him and was quiet for a while, which was comfortable between them now. The silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. You doing all right, he said. Yes, she said. Business good. Good enough, she said. I'm not getting rich. I'm doing what I want to do. He nodded, drank his coffee, looked at the old Harley. Do you still think about that day, he said, at Bobby Trask's? She considered it. I think about why he put it there, she said. I think about the fact that he'd had that bike at Bobby's lot for years and he'd registered it in my name and he just waited. Trusted that eventually I'd find my way back to Ridgecrest and find it. She paused. That's a long bet to make. Thomas was a patient man, Jack said. He was, she said. He was also right. Jack set his mug down. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first day on Route 14, the measuring quality. The attention, except now the measurement was of something different, something settled rather than uncertain. He didn't leave you a broken motorcycle, Jack said. It was what he'd told her that first night at the clubhouse all those months ago when the drawings were fresh on the table and the full weight of what she'd found was still settling. She looked at the old Harley, the machine she'd bought for $46, a machine her father had sealed with his life's most important work and left in the most unlikely place, trusting in the most unlikely person, making the longest possible bet with the steadiest possible hand. No, she said, he left me everything. And that was the truth of it, all of it, from the first morning at the fence, to the hall in Albuquerque, to this shop in these hands, and the two names in the permanent record, and the apprentices learning in the space her father never got to stand in. He had taken 30 years of loss and silence and sealed it in a frame tube and trusted her to break it open at the right moment. And she had, and what came out was not just the past reclaimed, but the future made possible, her own future. Built on his foundation, carrying his name forward, not as a burden or an obligation, but as something she had chosen and earned and made her own. Thomas Bennett's daughter had come home. She had finished what he started, and she had made it more than he could have imagined, because that is what daughters do with what their fathers leave them. They don't just preserve it, they build.